On November the 7th, 1940, a brand new bridge in Washington state twisted itself apart in a 42-mile-an-hour wind, and the only casualty was a dog left behind in a car. That bridge had been swaying so badly for months that engineers gave it a nickname, Galloping Gertie, and drove across it anyway, for fun. I'm Silas, and this is Silas Explains the Past. I collect the moments history tried to warn us, and nobody listened. Tonight, 6 bridges, dams, and towers that came down in front of witnesses, inspectors, even the men who built them. One of these failures killed over 400 people, and the man who ignored the cracks drove past them that very morning. Number 6. The Quebec Bridge. In the summer of 1907, workers were racing to finish the longest cantilever bridge ever attempted, spanning the St. Lawrence River in Canada. The chief engineer, back in his New York office, had already been warned. A junior inspector named Norman McClure wrote letters describing steel members bending under their own weight, weeks before completion. His warnings were dismissed as overcaution. On August 29, 1907, at 5:45 in the evening, the south arm of the bridge collapsed in 15 seconds, dragging 86 men down with the twisted steel. 75 of them died, most of them Mohawk ironworkers from the Kanawake community, whose skill on high steel had made them essential to the project. The investigation that followed found the deflection had been visible for weeks, measured, recorded, and explained away as normal settling. The designers had also badly underestimated the bridge's own dead weight, a basic calculation error compounded by pressure to finish on schedule and under budget. When the bridge was finally rebuilt and completed in 1917, it became the longest cantilever span in the world, a record it still holds today. But it stands, quite literally, over the graves of the men whose deaths rewrote the rules. Canada's engineering licensing system, and much of the continent's structural oversight, traces directly back to that August evening on the St. Lawrence. Number 5. The Ashtabula Bridge disaster. In December of 1876, an iron railway bridge in Ohio carried the Pacific Express across a deep ravine, as it had done thousands of times before. The bridge's designer, a railroad president named Amasa Stone, had overruled his own engineers years earlier, insisting on an experimental iron truss design to save money against the advice of the man he'd hired to build it. On the night of December 29th, in the middle of a snowstorm, the train's rear cars began to sag as they crossed the span. Within moments, the entire bridge gave way, dropping 11 rail cars nearly 70 feet into the frozen ravine below. Stoves from the heating system set the wreckage alight, and by morning, 92 passengers had died, many from the fire rather than the fall itself. Survivors later testified the bridge had groaned and flexed on earlier crossings, complaints that had reached the railroad but never reached a structural review. Stone, devastated by the scale of what his shortcut had caused, took his own life 2 years later. The disaster led directly to the founding of the American Railway Master Mechanics Association's safety codes, and to one of the first widespread adoptions of steel rather than iron in American bridge construction. A quiet, permanent shift that came only after the ravine had already claimed its passengers. Number 4. The Tay Bridge collapse in Scotland. When it opened in 1878, it was the longest bridge in the world, and its designer, Thomas Bouch, was knighted for the achievement within the year. But Bouch had underestimated something simple and violent: wind. His calculations for wind pressure on the structure were roughly a tenth of what later standards required, a shortfall nobody outside his own office checked. On the stormy night of December 28, 1879, a train crossing the bridge in gale-force winds derailed as 13 of the central spans simply toppled sideways into the River Tay, taking the train and everyone aboard with it. All 59 passengers and crew were killed. Not a single body was recovered intact from the icy water for weeks. The official inquiry was blunt. The bridge, it concluded, had been badly designed, badly built, and badly maintained. And Bouch himself had personally supervised corners being cut in the ironworks manufacture. He died less than a year later, his reputation and health both broken. Here's the strange footnote. The replacement bridge, opened in 1887, was built alongside the original surviving stone piers, which still stand in the river today, a line of stumps beside the new crossing, left as a permanent, silent reminder. British engineering afterward adopted formal wind-loading standards that remain in use to this day. Number 3. Ronan Point. Ask yourself, how much would you trust a building assembled like a stack of shoeboxes? That's essentially what a Ronan Point was. A 22-story tower in London built from precast concrete panels, bolted together at the joints, a fast, cheap method popular across post-war Britain. In the early hours of May 16, 1968, a resident on the 18th floor named Ivy Hodge lit her stove to make tea. A gas leak had filled her kitchen overnight, and the small explosion that followed blew out a single load-bearing wall panel. Because the building's entire structure depended on each panel supporting the one above it, that one missing wall triggered a chain reaction. An entire corner of the tower, from the 18th floor to the roof, collapsed straight down, crushing the floors below on the way. 4 people died, remarkably few given the scale of collapse, largely because it happened at 5:45 in the morning when most residents were still in bed on the building's other side. Investigators found the panel connections used far less bolting and mortar than the design specified, corners quietly cut during construction to save time. The inquiry led to entirely new building codes requiring structures to survive the loss of any single element without total collapse, a principle called disproportionate collapse that still governs tower design today in nearly every country that builds with precast concrete. Number 2. Galloping Gertie herself, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. From the day it opened in July 1940, drivers noticed the deck rippled and rolled beneath their wheels in even a modest wind, a sensation so pronounced that thrill-seekers drove out just to feel it, and the press had already nicknamed it before its first accident. Engineers noted the oscillations in their reports, but the bridge's slender, shallow design, chosen for its elegant, economical look rather than its rigidity, meant nothing was structurally changed. On the morning of November 7, 1940, in winds of only about 40 miles an hour, nowhere near a true storm, the deck began twisting instead of simply bouncing. A violent side-to-side motion engineers hadn't accounted for. A local news editor named Leonard Coatsworth abandoned his car on the bridge and crawled to safety on his hands and knees, leaving behind his daughter's cocker spaniel, Tubby, who could not be coaxed out and became the collapse's only casualty. Less than an hour later, the entire center span tore loose and fell into Puget Sound, captured on film by a University of Washington professor who happened to be testing a new camera nearby, footage still shown in engineering classrooms worldwide. The disaster gave rise to the modern science of bridge aerodynamics. Every major suspension bridge built since has been wind tunnel tested because of what those film reels revealed. And number 1, the one nobody saw coming until it was already crumbling beneath their feet, the St. Francis Dam. Built in the early 1920s to store water for a booming Los Angeles, it stood 185 feet tall in a canyon north of the city, the pride of chief engineer William Mulholland, already famous for the aqueduct that had made the city's growth possible. In the months before the collapse, cracks appeared in the dam's concrete and dark, muddy water seeped from its base, signs a dam keeper reported repeatedly. On the morning of March 12, 1928, Mulholland personally inspected a new leak himself and pronounced the dam safe. Less than 12 hours later, just before midnight, the dam failed completely, releasing roughly 12 billion gallons of water down the canyon in a wall nearly 140 feet high. The flood tore through the valley for over 54 miles before reaching the ocean, destroying entire communities in the dark with almost no warning. Estimates put the death toll above 400, making it the second deadliest disaster in California history after the 1906 earthquake, and many victims were never identified, swept out to sea. Mulholland took full responsibility publicly, telling the inquiry he envied the dead and he never worked as a public engineer again. The disaster ended the era of one man single-handedly approving major dam designs. California created independent state oversight boards for dam safety almost immediately, a system that, in various forms, still governs dam construction across America today. 6 structures, 6 warnings that were seen and set aside, a groaning joint, a leaking wall, a bridge that danced in the wind for months before it fell. History, as ever, was not finished handing us the same lesson twice. Every safety code we take for granted today, every wind tunnel test and inspection board, was paid for by someone who noticed too late. If you were standing on that dock, that bridge, that tower, which warning sign do you think you'd have caught? Tell me in the comments. And if these forgotten corners of history are your kind of fireside tale, subscribe to Silas Explains the Past. There's always another story waiting in the dark.